Gravity Rush 2 on the PS4, the sequel to the already reviewed on this channel Gravity Rush on the Vita, a game made by Japan Studio and specifically their Gravity team, which worked on the original Gravity Rush and of course the Siren series. The reason I'm mentioning this now is because after recent events at Japan Studios, this might be unwillingly the final Team Gravity game. And I don't know about you, but this definitely gives me a different perspective reviewing this game, maybe a less optimistic one. But regardless, I'm still going to approach this review like any other, just don't expect me to say something like, I hope they fix this in the sequel. Anyways, starting with the story of Gravity Rush 2, being a direct sequel of the first game, now Kat, our main character, and her friends are in a different world and now working for this sort of mining community that's like a village all to itself dedicated to traveling around and mining that ore that is also used to level up your character. And yes, that is the same crystal that is used in the original game. And while I think this is actually a pretty interesting setup, this is very much just the opening of the game. Eventually the game just goes back to a very similar setting to the original. And unfortunately it does end up feeling a bit like a retread of the original. Themes just seem a lot more on the nose this time around, like the themes of social hierarchy and corruption that are a lot more in your face, so to say, and it just doesn't feel as well done as it does in the original. Also, with the main characters already having been developed in the original game, there's just a lot less mystery around this world and its people, and also just a lot of less general growth. And the new characters don't really fulfill that need to the story, because again of the less subtle themes of this game, which kinda end up giving these new characters more predictable arcs. That being said, overall it's not bad, but it can feel like they never expected to write a sequel to the original. Which, to be fair, I don't think anyone making games for the Vita thought about stuff like that. Since we're here, speaking of the Vita, then let's now talk about the graphics. Even though this is a different world, it follows very much in the same aesthetics of the steampunk world of the previous game. But this time around, there are just a lot more differences between islands, even within the same areas, and the world is just so much more colorful and detailed. Everything just stands out a lot more and in a good way. Honestly, I think this footage does not make it justice since it's mostly from the initial mining part of the game's plot. What was a really impressive video game now gets to really reach its potential in this sequel. Now, and this is not a complaint, but more of an observation, and that is that Gravity Rush on the Vita was really pushing that console to its limits. Now on the PS4, while I think it looks great, it's clear that it's not really pushing the console, especially in the texture department. Some textures don't so much look bad as they look like they're from a different generation. This is most noticeable in large ground textures like grass, dirt, and rocks. It's a minor detail and it doesn't affect my enjoyment of the game, but it is something worth pointing out. It definitely would have been interesting to see this game push the limits of the PS4, but I doubt that this game ever had the budget that allowed for that, and unfortunately I doubt it will ever have it now. Regardless, in my opinion, this is still an absolutely gorgeous looking game aesthetically in a world built around floating cities, which, yes, leads us to talk about the gameplay that for the most part has not changed much aside from the new additions and a little balancing with the already existing abilities. So let's start with the basics. Kat, the character you play as, can run and jump around and of course attack like any other game, but of course with the main gimmick of being able to control gravity, allowing you to pick the orientation of gravity, for example walk on the side or underneath buildings, or simply to fly, which in my original review I compared it to feeling like Superman, and that's still here. Not much has changed once again. You can also attack using your powers, and surprisingly the controls from the Vita with the touchscreen finishers now being on the touchpad of the PS4 controller, and the gyroscope controlled camera during flight again now being done with the gyroscope of the controller. It's fairly simple. The major change to what was already here is in the special attacks. In the original game I mentioned that they felt overpowered. It was a situation of use them to win the game. Especially the first one you get, where you go into a spin that locks onto enemies' weak spots, and that hasn't changed here. What has changed is how often you get this attack by raising the rarity of the items that recharge your special attack bar. It is a very simple solution, but it works. Now moving on to the actual new features of Gravity Rush 2. The main one being the two new gravity styles that allow you to alter gravity in new ways with Lunar Style and Jupiter Style. And as you can probably guess by the names, these styles make gravity work in similar ways to the gravity of those planet/satellite, with the lunar style letting you do longer and higher jumps, but it also, maybe a little less logically, also allowing you to move faster and also teleport during zero gravity combat. These less logical upgrades probably done to differentiate itself from the regular style. Then Jupiter style does of course the opposite, making you move slower and having your gravity gauge depleting faster. But of course now hitting a lot harder with your basic attacks and being able to do a variation of the flying attack by charging it for more damage. Also, for those unaware, you do have a gravity gauge that determines how long you can fly for, but the thing is, both in the original and here, you can fly for a whole lot more than you can fall. By that I mean, if you run out of energy, you will quickly recharge the bar without losing much progress, which makes sense given you use these powers to traverse around the large open world, and it's mostly here just to give you some challenge during combat. Other thing about this new style before I give my opinion on them is that each one has its own special attack that activates when you use your special attack ability while having that style activated. Even if, let's be honest, they're not as overpowered as the original special attacks. Regardless, changing between styles is very simple as well, simply doing it by swiping the touchpad on the PS4 controller, unless you're in a section where you are forced to use certain styles, which leads me to talk about my biggest problem with these powers, and that is the lack of use for them. We are talking about a game where you can fly, so adding new forms of locomotion can feel a little futile, even if they feel good to play with, leading to the game have to create a situation where it forces you to play with them, which is fine enough, but they can get jarring with these sections going on for a bit too long, especially the slower style Jupiter. An example that maybe will help you understand this better is in Saints Row 4 of all places, a game that has cars like any other Saints Row game, but because in that game you have superpowers, you very early on in the game gain powers that turn them basically useless gameplay wise. And that's basically what's happening here, except imagine that these Jupiter and Lunar style are cars, and imagine that the cars only show up like 5 hours into the game. That does sound a bit overly negative, because I do think it does work for the gameplay, even though Gravity Rush 2 doesn't really have much in new types of enemies. These new styles actually just end up working really well with the older enemies, with fast enemies working well with the Lunar style and heavily armored enemies working well with the Jupiter style. And overall, even with my critique of it, I still did enjoy these new additions. The other addition I didn't so much care for was the talismans. This one very simple, they're equipable items that increase your powers in various different and very video gamey ways, like raising one of your ability bars or health bar, or making something like the lunar jump longer, stuff like that. And there are 3 slots. Each slot can only take a certain type of talisman, and of course there are 3 types of talismans that you can find throughout the world or receive as a reward. But you can also mix these talismans to craft stronger ones. Now, a final thing I want to talk about before I move on is I want to say that I did enjoy the gameplay here, even if it can feel like a retread of the original game with a lot of the same old enemies, even with these new styles. But the one thing that this game does that's really souring is the stealth missions. They are just not well implemented. There's almost never anything to tell your state in these stealth sections until you actually get caught. And getting caught is a instant failure state. It more often than not discourages you from using your powers over working with them, and it's legitimately annoying. It feels so out of place in a game that makes you feel so free to suddenly be so shackled. It's a really odd decision in my opinion. Maybe they were trying to add some variety, but honestly it doesn't work like that. Regardless, to finish this off, now let's talk about the soundtrack, which I'll be quick because it's really good like Gravity Rush 1. There's a very orchestral and melodic feeling to it, and it fits that steampunk look. It's great. And overall, this game is great, just a bit too similar to its prequel, and with some odd level design decisions that kind of push the experience down a bit. And for those reasons, and of course, the review I just gave, I am giving Gravity Rush 2 a 7 out of 10. Recommendations wise, though, it's very simple. Play this one if you want more Gravity Rush. If you have not played Gravity Rush, then I recommend the first one, especially now that there is a remake for it on the same console as this one. The only reason to play this one before the first one is if you simply just have this one for whatever reason. Regardless of your decision though, I hope that this video helped you make it, and regardless of that, I hope that you at least enjoyed watching. And if so, please consider subscribing, liking, and even commenting. All things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye.